Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kelsey Goforth, and I'm DWDC's Program Director. I'm thrilled to welcome you today to the second session of this year's Focused Forum, Reflections on Death and Dying, Creating Space for End-of-Life Conversations. Today's topic is Looking Back, a history of attitudes towards death and dying. Today, I'm speaking to you from the traditional territory of many nations, including the Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, located in Toronto and covered by Treaty 13. I acknowledge the legacy of colonialism and the impact it has had on the areas of life for Indigenous peoples, including healthcare. As part of DWDC's adherence to the values of inclusion and people-centeredness, we're committed to working towards recognizing, respecting, and addressing the distinct health needs of Métis, Inuit, First Nations, and Indigenous peoples related to end-of-life and medical assistance in dying. We will continue to work to listen to and amplify the voices of Indigenous communities in the discussions of end-of-life choice. So before we get started and welcome today's presenter, I just had a few housekeeping items to go over. As mentioned, this is our second session in the Focused Forum series that we're doing this year. We will be meeting again at the end of April. We have a couple sessions scheduled, and we'll be sending out the email invitation and the Zoom links to register shortly. So please look for that in your inbox in the coming weeks. I'd also like to remind everyone that you are muted today, so we can't hear you, but we would love to hear your questions or comments. You can submit your questions by clicking on the Q&A box. You can see that at the bottom of your screen along the Zoom side panel, and we'll read out your question for you at the end. Please keep your question as concise and clear as possible. We do have a lot of you registered today, and we're happy to have you, and we'd like to try to address as many questions as we can. Also, if you have a question that's more personal in nature, you're welcome to email us at support@dyingwithdignity.ca or call us. The toll-free number is on your screen there, and we can address your question and give you support directly. We also have a post-webinar survey that's going to pop up on your screen when we wrap up this afternoon. If you could take a few minutes to fill that out, that would be appreciated. We'd love to hear your feedback on how today's session went. Now we're going to introduce today's speaker. Okay, great. So we have Olga Nikolajev.
That's good, Kelsey. Nikolajev.
Nikolajev, end-of-life nurse educator, a dying well advocate, cannabis educator, and end-of-life doula mentor with over 25 years of professional experience as a registered nurse in various healthcare settings, including hospice palliative care. Olga has been involved in national, provincial, and local community efforts to shift the way we view and approach our dying experience, death, and grief. Olga is the founder and director of dyingmatters.ca, a death awareness and educational social enterprise, and is the founder and director of the Death Doula Ontario Network, which she founded in June 2020. Welcome, Olga, and thank you for being with us this afternoon. So, as we know, we're here to talk about a history of attitudes towards death and dying. So to get us started, could you describe to us what you think the attitudes towards death and dying are right now in Canada?
Well, I think before I do that, it might be also good to also add some more background in relationship to why would you want to even listen to me? So in addition to all of those different things that you mentioned, which really means that I'm really interested in dying and death and how we think about how we approach it. I've also been really embedded in the field of thanatology. So I am a fellow in thanatology, somebody who educates others and provides support in helping people to navigate not only end-of-life care, but also attitudes and our approaches to death itself, to death care, to the different ways in which we think about and how we, in some way, kind of navigate through all of the different changes that are happening. So it's good to know who and where the person is coming from and their particular knowledge. So how would I describe the attitudes towards dying and death in Canada right now? Wow, I think maybe we can better understand if we take a look at maybe what is the level of death anxiety, which is that uncertainty that people may feel around end of life care. If you dive, sort of look back, right? So if we historically look back over the last 50 years, we have actually been moving towards expanding our understanding of end of life, our understanding of dying, of the dying process, and how we can intersect and interject, and how we can make it easier, how we can make it more comfortable, even shall we say, even well, right? Dying well. And I think that has a lot to do with a rise in our education and the interest that there is in end of life care, because I think a lot of folks are feeling the anxiety, right? Let's look at the demographic of Canada. If you look at the numbers in sheer sort of broad strokes, looking at the age, then you see there's a potentially, we talk about that large population of the baby boomers who will be coming close to their dying process. Certainly they are the ones who right now are the vast majority of folks undertaking a lot of care so they can be well, live as long as possible, right? If we look at Canada in the context within the world sort of death index, or looking at even mortality rates, you see that there is a lot more longevity with countries who are considered, and I put that in quotation, more developed, because that's a whole other conversation around what that means. So I think the broad stroke, so are there, how are we capturing the death anxiety, right? What are people uptaking in relationship to knowledge related to end of life care? And certainly you might have some of that information related to how many people are actually engaging in the webinars, how many more things that you've put out there, Dying with Dignity, as a way of informing people and having that uptake. Because I think the recent history and our current still history of the pandemic, and the maybe an increase of our fear of dying, certainly of being very, very sick while we're dying, or dying because of a simple, not necessarily easy, but a simple infection, that all will have an impact on our particular death anxiety. And so I think there's a lot more uptake in the education, and people wanting to know how they can better find comfort, how they can better care for themselves and others. The other is, and it's related to sort of level of death anxiety, is death literacy, which is, right, the knowledge. So how much experience you have with end of life care, that will shape your attitudes, right? So even in the shifting Canadian population, you will see the diversity of cultural norms around dying and death, which might be very different from, some of the sort of, will be a good word, maybe I don't want to say general, because it's difficult to find the words as we're changing even our demographics, right? So all in all, to say that we're recognizing that there are these different ways that our dying attitudes and the approach to dying and death are shifting through our anxieties or fears, through those cultural norms, through the education, and also where we are willing to create spaces to have those conversations, right? So where are we willing to publicly have a safe enough space, like a death cafe, to invite people to have these oftentimes difficult conversations, but to do it in such a way that it's not intrusive, or in a way that we have to have them, but as a way of an invitation into this deeper conversation around death and dying. And that includes advanced care planning, right? So the initiatives that are put forth by Dying with Dignity, by the Canadian Hospice Palliative Care Association, by all of those different social organizations that are really moving to elevate that death literacy as a way of reducing death anxiety. So that might have been more than a simple question, because if you know anything about me, you know I don't necessarily like to do the broad stroke. What are the attitudes? Because what you'll hear is oftentimes is we are a death ignorant, death avoidant society, right? And it's, yes, that is actually part of the death anxiety. If you dive into any of the work by Dr. Gabor Mate, he actually says that avoidance and resistance is born from anxiety. So if we have death anxiety, which is a fundamental, sometimes an unconscious fear that we have, right, then we're going to resist that thing that we are most afraid of, right? It's a natural response even for us to resist it, to move away from it, because we're afraid of it.
Thank you. That's fascinating. And I think, you know, going back to the pandemic, you mentioned in your answer, you know, we certainly saw an increase in requests for information and people trying to get a better understanding of what that would mean for them if they did get COVID, and what medical treatments would be available or not available, and if they would have the right to refuse certain things or not. So when that new thing came into our lives and sort of disrupted everything and got these other thoughts and worries flowing, the result was, you know, quite an increase in what does this actually mean for me and mean for my end of life and what things might look like. So thank you for that answer. And you talked a bit about this as well, but in terms of specific factors, there seems to be many. Can we talk about maybe family and the media and some of the other factors that might play into how we think about death and dying?
Absolutely. I think those are, you know, so how does one feel about dying and death, right? So what do we kind of understand on the personal? So I already talked about the fact that we have some level of death anxiety, right? Even if we know, even if we have an awareness, this is something what rattles in my brain, and oftentimes is, you know, just because you know something doesn't necessarily mean that you're not afraid of it, or that you're open to and you're okay with it, or whatever that means. And I don't even know what that word means. I think we're at a also a stage in our maybe our human evolution, dare I say, although I see some repeated patterns which need to go, but we're looking at, right, the different approaches to this reality, the thing that is not opposite of life, that is opposite of birth, that doesn't only touch us as humans, but it happens to every living organic thing in this universe, right? This notion of birth and death. And so in the time that we have here, the way in which we think about approaching the end of this particular life experience has a lot to do with your family, has a lot to do with your culture, with the way that you initially learned as a child. And again, even the attitudes that you might take in have a lot to do with your developmental age. You know, kids who are 5 have very different understanding of dying and death and what it means, and sometimes require the adults to adapt to a different kind of language so they better grasp what the meaning of this particular event, because they don't know, and they can't know, right? They can't know. One of the things that is, I think, happening in the social support world, especially with children, is recognizing that children actually are not resilient in themselves. How we become resilient is when we have a container of resilience, you could say, right? That again, Gabor Mate talks about how resilience is not a personal or an individual quality, but it's actually a social quality. How do we help each other? How do we raise each other up? How do we provide the container in which we can be ourselves, be authentic, right? In all of the different ways. So first is to potentially look at your family. What did you learn about death and dying? Was that something, you know, somebody once asked me, why are you interested in this? And so I could look back again in my own history, now having kind of had 2 lifetimes, being in my 50s, looking back from a different perspective, because certainly I had a different one when I was 20 something. And so even your attitude as you look back towards end of life or death and dying is going to change. It's inevitable, right? As I oftentimes joke in the training saying, if any of you are over 42, you're on the other, the other side of your half shelf life because you're now approaching the end, right? So if your family didn't necessarily talk about, or maybe they had a structure, or maybe they didn't talk about because there were already social and cultural norms where it didn't require the discussion of who's going to do what. Think about that, right? How through the process of secularization, if that's a word, and the removal of oftentimes religion from the dying process, because it was more sort of, governed by provision of healthcare, then it changes, right? It changes how we process it, even within our own family. So that's again to say that second sort of outer way, or the factor that influence our own attitude towards dying and death has to do with the social and cultural norms, right? I oftentimes, again, used to think that if people didn't talk about, or if they didn't use the D word, that somehow they were avoidant. And it's not necessarily true, because you have to understand what are the narratives, the social and cultural narratives around dying and death, because they may not be using the D words, but there might still be the way of completing unfinished business, or approaching it without necessarily using those words. So personal, right? Family. And as we get older, that shifts. It's going to continue to change. It's going to continue to change based on the kind of relationship that you have. What's the container? I oftentimes talk about that the death literacy or death anxiety even is it's based on this notion of relational autonomy. Even decisions around end of life care and the preferences and wishes, and how we direct others to actualize what it is that we would like to experience. That's all happening in this, construct of me as an individual, but always in relationship to someone else, to something else. And this is oftentimes the tension, right? This is what I want, but you can't have that right now, but I want it. Right. And then how society then sort of listens, right? Wait a minute, do we have laws that actually harm, right? And then the conversation, the ethical conversation, the responsibility between the individual and the society starts to happen, right? That kind of tension.
Thank you. So you touched on a bit about culture, and there's so many beautiful cultures that we could examine. That would be a whole separate webinar, a whole day really, that we could delve into that. But I'm wondering if you have a few examples of different religions or cultures and how they approach death and dying that might be quite unique and worth mentioning.
I think that there's so much diversity that I would actually do harm in identifying one over another. And so the first understanding, and again, some of my background and some of the training and my time spent in both energy and money, everything was, in looking at different religious community of faith, different cultural kind of practices related to dying and death, looking at the huge diversity. And it's so diverse that it's really sometimes difficult or to identify sort of, there are principles, let's just say that. There are principles in sort of common practices within dying and death across culture, right? It doesn't mean that they're all going to be the same, but, let's say if I was to just talk about 3 different kind of stages or phases, there's the planning and preparing. So how does an individual, how does a family, how does a society plan and prepare for this end of life? We all know it's going to happen. At some point in time, you come to understand that it's going to happen. So it's also about how do you provide support in your own community, right? And there are, so again, what are the conversations? How do we plan? So in the Western world, there's a lot more in Western culture, you could say, right? Because that's not only about religion, but also about cultural norms. There's a lot more focus on the individual planning and preparing, right? The self responsibility that you have. In other cultures, let's in our Indigenous cultures within Canada, and sometimes this is where the conflict sometimes happens, the decisions around planning and preparing may be more communal, maybe more related to family. Having said that, I think even the Western culture has a lot of that. It's just that we haven't necessarily talked about how actually people make decisions about end of life. They actually do talk to their family members. They do talk to their friends. We just maybe haven't been asking the right questions, right? As to how do we do this? And then, so planning and preparing, then there's the approach and the common practice related to the active dying, right? So do we have a sort of a way of knowing when somebody is approaching death? And again, some of that is deeply rooted into where is this care held? And if it's held within healthcare, then you're going to have the guidelines, you're going to have, the sort of approaches more related to let's do as much as we can until we can't, and then we'll hand off to palliative care or hospice. And so all of those ideas are developed then. And then you have post-death care and the way in which we comfort those who are now grieving the particular loss of this individual, if we're talking about person death. But they're all going to be very different, right? So and I think the key also to remember is that some of those cultural norms are not only sort of philosophical, but they're also deeply rooted in the earth, in the environment, sometimes even the physical environment. They're deeply rooted into, right, the social structure. So in some parts of the world where maybe there isn't the ability to dig holes as a way of creating graves, there will be different practices in relationship to body disposition, right? In the same way that if healthcare and isn't a provision for everyone, and certainly even in Canada, right? Consider palliative care is only accessible by about 35% of Canadians. And so you're going to have a different experience of the dying process, right? I would far more encourage folks to go on to a website such as Living My Culture, where you have the people themselves talking about their personal experience. I can speak to you for a long time about the experience of a cisgendered, white, 50s, non-married, non-children, parents, nobody around to take care of. I can speak to you about that because that's the filter through which I see my personal approach to death and dying, right? And so again, the culture and the interest of how people do this is quite interesting, because it also speaks to them saying, well, wait a minute, ours isn't the right way or the only way or the good way or the whatever way. Right? That there are these other expressions of how communities care for people who are approaching their end of life through the dying process and beyond. But there are some really interesting ones out there, that's for sure, right? The other good resource might be somebody like Caitlin Doty, who is a funeral director in California. She's quite sort of pushing the envelope, and she wrote a book called From Here to Eternity, which talked about and gave a snippet of some of these diverse cultural norms and how they themselves are shifting, right? Consider in certain parts of the world, the way in which, body disposition is happening. It's a different way, or the way in which even, dying with dignity, having the right to having medically assisted death is now going out into the broader scape, making those shifts in the I guess the social way in which we care for people, right? Because it requires not only a change for the front line. I mean, these are laws, right? They're decriminalizing the structures of how we behave. That's a really big thing.
Absolutely. And that's a great resource. I'm going to get the link and pop that into the chat so folks can check out the Living My Culture website. So I'll do that in just a second for everybody. Shifting gears a little bit, and you mentioned this when you talked about aging and how that will change people's perspectives and thoughts about deaths in a lot of cases. So with age aside, what happens when somebody gets a diagnosis of, say, a terminal condition that is going to have a great impact on what's going to happen in their life over the next several years? How does that impact their attitudes?
Well, again, I think if I speak from the experience of even being a palliative care nurse in the community, and having the front line sort of experience of comforting people after a terminal diagnosis or a life-limiting illness, I think that there's, again, it depends. That's where I always start with, well, it depends. Because it does depend. It depends on the person. So what's their particular approach? What we know from the literature and the other folks who are, observing and willing to research this is that oftentimes when people initially receive a diagnosis, because it can be a shock, especially when it's one that is of a terminal diagnosis, not even a life limiting, but this is like, we know 2 to 5 years, this is what's going to happen. Your life will come to an end. I think that initially, like almost everyone, when we have that kind of awareness of a loss, we go through the grieving process. And part of the initial acute grief is to distance ourselves from that particular reality. And it's for a couple of reasons. It's actually an adaptive way to not be or create that distance between the shock of what's happening, so that the person could, still be able to navigate their life in a way that they need to, right? Because it's not like you get the diagnosis and your life changes, right? That there are things that you need to still continue to do oftentimes until, you acquire more support or looking at that. So I think for some folks, it might be that it gives them the ability to maybe, again, it depends on the person. But if, for me, let's turn it around in a different way, maybe. So I have not had a life-limiting terminal diagnosis, but I know that my life will end. And so my death anxiety right now sits in the place of a sudden death. That's where it sits, because at any point in time, anything could happen to me. I can't guarantee that my life will continue. But I think for folks who may have some sense of what will cause their end, because it doesn't necessarily mean that they will die of that disease. Oftentimes people actually don't. They get very, very sick, and it makes them susceptible to some of the other simple infections, or even things like COVID. That was the big fear, right? That this virus would actually affect people who were most vulnerable, right? And it certainly did. But I think there's an opportunity for somebody who has this awareness to maybe have some insight on how to plan, or be able to spend some time to really think about and contemplate, what do you want to focus on for the time that you have left? How do you want to experience this, right? I think, from a death philosophy perspective, I think that death awareness has an opportunity for us to contemplate our own life and to see, have we made a positive impact? Have we made an impact? How did we live in our life? But it also, I think, could, as a pragmatic person, it could also allow people to kind of better plan, to have a conversation with their healthcare team to say, how do we approach this? You already know something about, we already know some things about specific diseases and how the kind of experience that people may have. And then we can better plan so that the experience of that process can be as comforting as whatever it is that they may want, or what's important to them in relationship to, this is how much time you have left. How would you like to experience this time that you have left? So on the one hand, it could drive somebody to not pay as much attention to that in the shock of that diagnosis. But on the other hand, and maybe it's not a binary, I think we're moving away from the binary world. Maybe it's more about, right, these layers and sort of these ripples of awareness, right? Because you're not always going to be accepting, there's going to be moments where you're going to be in these different stages and phases of this process. So it can be. I always say, I would like to know so I can better plan, but the reality is that I don't know. And so until my body or something says to me, okay, something's off, right? Or until I have that genetic profiling, I'm not going to necessarily know what may cause, but I know it's going to happen, old age, use, wear and tear.
Thank you for that. And you mentioned the idea of death anxiety. So, I mean, people might say or believe that they're more or less anxious about death at a certain point in their life. But when it comes to, studies that have been done and investigations into death anxiety, how is that determined? How do you know how anxious or not you are about death?
So I think the one thing is there is a death anxiety that can be very debilitating, like any form of anxiety, right? It's sometimes, and people can experience it even as they're moving through understanding and planning and preparing, right? Because I think anxiety is the worry about the future and not being able to control, right? So it's this uncertainty, it's this inability of sort of navigating uncertainty. That's, the anxious about that which you can't control. And there are a number of different kind of tools that have been developed. So coming out of social research and out of psychology that talk about the death anxiety questionnaire, which will have things on it. And I'm just trying to look a little bit of it. Looking at things, do you worry about? One of the questionnaire had things like, do you worry about being buried alive, even, because that goes back to the historical, right, in which there was that reality, because we didn't necessarily know how to sort of ensure that the person, has died. So there are a number of different questionnaires that you could find. I think if it's an anxiety that's debilitating, then it might be even, pathological. And I don't mean as a illness, but as a condition in which you're not able to function in your everyday, right? So there are those folks who have what's called Thanophobia. So they have this uncontrolled fear of death, even though nothing has happened, right? And so that's kind of also the difference between somebody who's experiencing grieving. So you may be very anxious because of, your person, but it's localized, it's to the person, where, a general anxiety disorder or Thanophobia is really not localized to the person, but it's this general sense of anxiety that people may have. But a number of different questionnaires, right? Sometimes there is a death literacy questionnaire in relationship to how much knowledge do you have or know. And I wonder, that's a good question, Kelsey, because I wonder if for folks who do have some level of death anxiety, where would they go? So I think the first would be your family doctor to talk about anxiety around end of life or death, to see, is it localized pertaining to what's happening in the family or pertaining to what's happening to the person, or is it more generalized as a mental health problem, right, rather than something that has to do with the circumstances of someone's life, right? And then there's questionnaires like I said, pertaining to how much do you know, or how does your particular attitude, or what is your particular attitudes towards death and dying. And so a death anxiety questionnaire may tell you that you have high level of death anxiety, or low a level of death anxiety. But what might be missing is, well, how do we reduce it? Like, how do we reduce death anxiety? And what I've seen in some of the other, even in some of the groups in social media, is that a lot of folks engage in death education in order to reduce their death anxiety. So if I learn a bit more about, I might be able to reduce some of the tension of this uncertainty, right? Which I think that makes sense. That makes sense, because sometimes the unknown can be so big, and that once it's known, right? Once we identify the thing that we are afraid the most of then it reduces that fear. There is that possibility.
Interesting. So a bit of like exposure therapy in a bit.
Right.
I'm gonna learn about it. I'm gonna talk about it, and then it's a thing, and it's going to be what it is, but it's maybe not quite as scary for me or anxiety inducing.
Or developing the language or the coping mechanism to what is the part around the anxiety that is most anxious. It's in the same way with, as you talked about during the pandemic and people asking and having more questions, because what we know, again, from the literature and some of the research, is the primary fear that people have at the end of life is the fear of not being able to breathe. Mm. That's a very fun, because it's scary. If you've ever been in a situation where you're not able to catch your breath, it can be really, really scary. And so this was a respiratory infection, which then would make it very difficult. And so people automatically, maybe they didn't even know that that was their fear, but the breath is, without it, right, followed by water. Water is the next most important thing. And that's why people, again, right, in the natural process of dying, they stop drinking, because it's no longer the most important thing in sustaining life. And it's a natural process.
So speaking a little bit more about what death looks like for people, and I think we'd like to explore a bit about, the setting. Where are people dying? Who is there? Who's supporting them as they die? And what does that look like right now in Canada? And how might that look different today than it did 100 years ago or 200 years ago? What are we seeing in terms of the actual dying experience for most people?
Yeah. And I think that has to do, again, with the shifting of culture. So if we look at the last 50 years, or the next question you're going to ask me is in relationship to some of our attitudes from that historical perspective, right? So it's always in the container. So if in the 1600s we had these notions of how do we, have the narratives of navigating after death, because most people were worried about the after death part. Right? Am I going to go to heaven? Am I going to go to hell? What are the social cultural structures that I have to go through? Oftentimes reflecting, this is also the way in which you need to live your life in order to have access to these marvelous things after life, right? And so it wasn't necessarily, people died at home, right? They died in the field. They died wherever they died, because they also may have far more deaths may have occurred out of simple, not simple, but out of infections and those kinds of things. Or consider the fact that we didn't have the tools to investigate, to name a disease. So there may have been lots of people who continue to have died of cancer, or we didn't know. They bled out, they had a bleeding disease. What does that mean, right? And that was very complicated as well, and still continues to be, with some of the religious and spiritual ideas, not only in relationship to dying and death, but also in relationship to illness. What does illness mean? What does illness mean in your particular culture, in your particular faith, right? And so as we move through history, right, always sort of being chewed up by social norms, then we come to the present moment where most people, 65% of people, still die in the hospital, because most people right now are dying, right, very, very sick. They have multiple different diseases. When you look at the statistics of the common patterns of dying, it's only 10% of all deaths happen suddenly, right, without any warning. So a heart attack or a stroke, or even in the realm, if you want to look at across the board, homicide, suicide, a small percentage, not a huge percentage, but right. And then 40% of people have this decline where there's a predictability, because we've also investigated the cancers, right? We understand of how long it takes until this particular cancer ends your life. And so we're informed by that. And then you also have 40% of folks who die of a stuttering decline, which means that they have a number of different illnesses, right? Not only are we living longer, right, but we're also, here I am with the right, leading you to agree with me. We're also dying, or we're also living with multiple different conditions that complicate and limit our lifespan, right? And it may not necessarily be related to our own personal lifestyle or the things that we engage in. It also has to do with our society, right? It's not only because of me that I, eat that wonderful bacon. It's also because it's made available to me, right? So there's that relational autonomy as well, right? How are we doing this? And so we're pushing and kind of saying, well, wait a minute, why are we dying in hospital? Can we, the most comforting place most people find is at home, most people. And so let us make sure that we can provide support to those that are caring for them where they are most comfortable, because not everybody necessarily wants to die at home or has the opportunity or the availability. There you have even those undercurrents, right? Or the foundation of how these attitudes or how this care is put forth is founded on the social determinants of health. Again, who has access to, right? Who can, and so that the level of comfort, if we only have 35% of the Canadian population having access to palliative and hospice care that provides the optimal comfort and pain and symptom management during this process or laboring of dying, then again, right, as a society, we're sort of saying, okay, we need to expand this. How do we educate more people? How do we empower more people to take this on as a worthy cause? To then provide maybe the guidance, the resources, so that people can care for their own at home. So we can better understand that the natural process of dying is not an illness, and it doesn't belong necessarily in an acute hospital setting, but is best cared for when people are in the place that they find most comforting. I certainly would want to have my end of life be in the height of love and comfort. I want to hear the most soothing things as I'm leaving, as I'm exiting this particular life experience, and whatever that means. My desire would be to kind of crescendo, like BJ Miller says, just kind of explode into death. I know that that's a wonderful sort of romantic notion, and it may not, but if I have any impact on the way in which I can comfort myself and give direction to others, and that's what I would want to have, right? That's why we oftentimes talk about the important things that people want to hear when they're at the end of life. I love you, forgive me, I forgive you, and thank you, right? Gratitude being a really big piece. So, and again, we need to have that historical perspective to also recognize that palliative care was something that was started in the 70s. It's only been around for 50 years. And I know that seems like a long time, but being in my 50s, it's not that long. And also knowing that social change takes a long time before it becomes the norm, right? Oftentimes we're frustrated through the labors until we reach that tipping point where it becomes the norm, right? Oh, where it's no longer, oh, I didn't know that. It's now, oh yeah, I know that, right? We're not necessarily there yet.
Thank you for that. That's a lot to think about, just how things have changed and how things are continuing to change. And like you said, even if we've had something in place for a number of years, there's not that much awareness about it. And I think even with, palliative care, there's so many misconceptions about what that means and when it should start. And the palliative approach to care and how it's something that can be incorporated very early in somebody's trajectory. So lots to think about and continue to educate about. So some historians have described how death mentalities have shifted over time, and I think this is a interesting topic to dive into. So could you share a bit about those observations?
About death mentalities, is that what you said?
Yeah, and some of those you mentioned, like the fear of being buried alive and the Victorians and how they had a very interesting view of death and dying.
I think again, it's not surprising, right? I find it kind of fun when people find, I can't believe it, we didn't know this. But you have to look back and to be able to, I also studied a little bit of medical anthropology. So looking at how did we devise medical understanding, and it may surprise you to know that our fundamental knowledge of anatomy comes from those people who were willing to study corpses, who were willing to open dead bodies. Consider that even now, I think even in our Western modern secular world, I think that the funeral industry and the undertakers and those who care for, especially the dead, are still sort of seen as, oh, those over there in black with those long cars, and again, it's kind of how do we think about death, right? This dark, gloomy thing that happens to us, right? Again, those are all different attitudes. And so ask the question again, Kelsey, I'm sorry. How do we?
That's okay.
Mentality that shifted over times, right?
Yeah.
So I think about, Philippe Ariz, who is a historian, right? So those people who take the time to look back, to look at the literature, again, I fundamentally ask, well, who are they reading? Who are they asking? Because it really depends on who is looking and what are the questions that you are asking, right? I think one of the reasons why we have gone through these different historical shifts in our attitude towards dying and death, fundamentally also there was a tipping point that happened in the 60s, right? Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was kind of one of the first folks who said, let me sit with the people who are dying. Let me sit with the people who are grieving. Let's capture the different experiences that people have, and started to look at, the field of thanatology, the way in which people are impacted by the different kinds of deaths that happen. So traumatic deaths have a different impact on the way in which we take in that experience. Oftentimes may result in some post-traumatic stress disorder because maybe the person didn't have an opportunity to talk through their particular experience or come to understand their particular experience. So different forms of death will have different impact on the person, on their psyche, right? And so is also the relationship that they have, right? How close are they in those relationships, right? Family doesn't necessarily mean that, especially, family of choice may be more close than a family of origin, right? Or in their relationship. And so that may also complicate some of the grieving. Again, this is just now we're kind of discovering, oh, wait a minute, grief is actually something that we feel in the body. It's actually something that we feel in very certain parts of the brain. And here is now what is helpful, that if you not sort of resist the way in which your brain naturally searches and yearns for your person, because it's been hardwired for that reality to exist. If you observe and be mindful without resisting, your brain will start to relax those pathways, and it will become a little bit easier over time to create now new different pathways, right? But again, we didn't know this till fairly recently, because we have the ability to look inside of the brain, to capture and to come to some deeper understanding, right? We're able to take the time to have conversations with people who experience different forms of dying and death, or their willingness to share that with us, right? Where before, those were, again, with the history, there may have been this notion of the death that had to be tamed, right? How do we make it better? Which we're still hanging on to some of that. Or the death of self, again, we're still hanging on to some of that, right? That wasn't a new development. It occurred in different times of sort of Western philosophy. And then we had this notion of, this imminent death coming to us, right? So how do we better prepare? Or also acknowledging the fact of how the death experience or the death has a rippling effect, not only for the person, but not only for their family, but how it ripples out. And I think we've gone through this process of what some of the historians will call that invisible death. We've removed death. We've moved it out of the home into these places of the hospital and the residential hospices and the things. So as a way of removing. And I think what's happening now is that a lot of the community is saying, wait a minute, we need to be more in sort of in accordance with helping families to bring death home in some way, right? So that we can become a little bit more, I guess, more knowledgeable about the experience, because we've certainly been removed from the experience. For me as a hospice palliative care nurse, that was a real privilege to be invited into that experience. And so it informed a lot of my own life, and it also informed what I wanted to focus on as a way of helping other people to better understand, right, the complexity, the different nuances, and the ongoing changes that are going to happen and will continue to happen when it comes to dying and death, end of life decisions, choices, and how we learn about all that.
Thank you. So you mentioned, bringing death home, and I think we've seen a bit of that movement as well with people talking about home funerals and keeping bodies at home longer than maybe they did in the more recent past, and that kind of thing. So a question that might tie into that, and this is a question we got during registration from an audience member, is it weird to try to normalize death as a society? And how can we go about doing that? I guess as individuals, as groups, how would that happen?
I don't think it's weird. I think it's normal to inquire and to shift maybe some of the language, right? Let's look at the way in which just in the last 10 years, very intense in the last 5 years, there have been a huge shift on focusing on the language that we use, right? And how we communicate with others, how people identify themselves. How do we make space for the diversity of our identities, the diversity of how we want to express our life, who we want to love, where we want to live, all of those, and how we want to die, how we want to do our dying, and how we want to die. And so I think it's normal to want to shift that. I think the best approach, again, from my understanding, is about an invitation, right? Because I think sometimes there is this notion that I know better than, and so I'm going to teach you how to do this, or you need to shift your language. So remember when we started this conversation about the fact that, we can have, and just because somebody doesn't use the D word doesn't necessarily mean that they're not willing or want to or do talk about death and dying. So it's how we can develop these diverse ways of opening up the conversation, an invitation, right? Without sort of the need to correct or to say, no, you need to say it this way, right? Oftentimes I hear people who are wanting to support somebody who's grieving, and they oftentimes say, I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say, because they understand that some of the euphemisms or some of the ways in which sometimes are confusing or sometimes are off the mark. They don't enable the griever to acknowledge their pain that they're in, because sometimes they're more of the dismissive. Look at the bright side, which is helpful sometimes, but it's oftentimes most helpful if the griever themselves can help themselves to get to that point, right? And it sometimes feels harsh when somebody else is trying to get them there. Come on, get over this, right? You know, you can. All what they need sometimes is to know you're in pain, or I don't know what to say. And so I say to them, say that, be authentic. Say, I don't know what to say. Is there a better way that we can say passed away, that maybe isn't dead? Or what are the ways that we can talk about these things that aren't going to offend, or aren't going to attack, or aren't going to maybe should somebody. I don't like to shit on people. You should do this, right? So how do we open up those conversations? I think it's through invitations. It's through the inclusion of it. I don't know what this will be like for you. When I meet with client families, I oftentimes say, I'm not the expert. I know some things, and I'm here to help be with you through this process for as long as you want me to be through this process. And here are the things that I can share with you. And the more that you tell me about you, the more I can help you to navigate this process, because I am your person to help you through this. But I have no idea what it's going to be all about, because I've never gone through that process. You know, I started my career in labor and delivery, which is kind of interesting because I never had any children. And yet I was present with and caught a few and helped mom, learn how to initiate that bonding relationship with that first person, even though I've never had any children. Interesting, right? And then I choose to create or focus most of my life on the end of life process, which is a birth in a different kind of way, but still not knowing anything about it. So I'm in the business of studying the unknown and hopefully reducing some of that anxiety, because I think both anxieties live at both ends, right? Birth and death, very similar, because those are huge shifts. There's huge shifts in what it means to be us, and how do we navigate those connections and those relationships that we have with people? How do we tie, right? How do we tie together, even if it's through the birthing, or how do we untie through the dying process?
Very interesting. Another question that came through ahead of time through the registration is about, and this might tie into some of the invisible death topic as well. How does viewing the body of the deceased affect somebody's grief and how that's processed? And is there a difference in seeing the body of somebody who has died recently versus seeing them maybe in a setting where there's different lights and makeup and that kind of thing? The body's maybe embalmed. Does that have an impact on how we our attitudes towards death and how we're grieving that person?
Again, I think it would depend. It would depend, right? So when you look through, if you look again through the history, there are different cultural practices, and it again depends on, all of these other practices. So if a body is embalmed, or if it's prepared, it means that it's restored, it's kind of refreshed and sort of made so that the appearance can still be something that can be pleasant to people, right? So, how do we slow down the decomposition process so that we have a bit more time with the person to say our goodbyes? So we already know that there are lots of practices, right, that are in place as a way of slowing down that particular process. Or again, you have to look at the cultural and the religious norms, because in some communities and some cultures, there may be the let's connect with the person and let's have the community members prepare, not necessarily the family, and the person goes into the ground very shortly after death, right? Within sort of that first day cycle, if possible. So there is a removal, the person doesn't. But part of maybe their religious faith is also the way in which the community provides support, right? The way in which the community continues to kind of help with the untangling and the untying of that relationship that the person has. I think, again, some of the research shows that it can be helpful for people to have a physical contact with a person who has died. I think it's fundamentally is what I think is guiding some of the work of community death care and the roles of end-of-life doulas and death doulas is to enable families to provide them with that support so they can be present with the active dying process and after death, so they can come to understand the reality of what has occurred by allowing them to be present with it, by taking more time with it, right? So that the brain, again, can get used to this new particular reality that happens. Having said that, sometimes it can be very shocking, right? So again, look at the form of death, right? Because here we're not only talking about, we're talking about all forms. So if somebody dies in a traumatic accident, or, you know, the body is such that it's not necessarily conducive to seeing, but is there still a potential, you know, could they see, you know, a part of the hand, right? Or part of something. Again, I think the invisible death creates an anxiety in people of that uncertainty. I haven't seen, I haven't smelled, therefore it cannot be, right? Because that's part of our hard wiring in some ways, if we haven't touched it. And there is a difference, but there's also, you know, how do we provide a level of support, maybe when somebody who has gone through a very progressive illness, and they look very different, right? We also want to prepare people for this shock of this reality, especially if they haven't necessarily been present, where for them it may not be necessarily as helpful to see the person. Maybe what's more helpful is to have that picture so that they can still affiliate with, right? So again, it really depends on the relationship. Again, it depends on the type of death that has occurred, right? What's the state of the person? And then also on those cultural and religious norms, right? Sometimes the avoidance of not being, because again, we equate avoidance with the negative connotation. So sometimes not being present with may be actually the most helpful outcome, because it sustains the lasting memory that the person has, right? The one that they had. And sometimes it's good, sometimes that isn't good, right? Again, can we then help them? And yes, after, through the grieving process, I think a grief counselor is somebody who's very well skilled in going back to kind of recapitulate and guide a person through that process so they can shift the perception, right? The shock of that particular reality.
Thank you. We'll take a couple questions from the audience, live audience today. And one of them is about celebrations of life or living wakes and that kind of thing. So something that a person who is going to die soon plans and hosts themselves. Do you have any observations about that and what that does for the dying person and how that affects their last remaining days or weeks?
Again, it also depends, but I would say I had I served one of the client families that I supported. He actually had a living funeral. They had a barbecue on a spring day. His prognosis was 6 months, and I'm not even sure if he actually lived beyond his 6 months prognosis. But they had a big party, and they didn't necessarily have it focus on the fact that he was going to die. It was an opportunity for him to still speak to his friends and to gather together. In some way, I think birthdays should be that, even though I don't like to shit on. But I think that's a celebration. It's like another year. Woo! Oh my goodness! You know, woohoo! Right? Let's celebrate. And here are the things that I really want you to remember. And I haven't been present with the living funeral. I think it would be I think it can be very emotionally big, if you know what I mean. Like it can be very full, right? Think about, emotions such as sadness or even gratitude and love, right? Sometimes they can be really big, spill out in your ear, your eyes start to pee, those kinds of things. And I remember watching a documentary in which a woman in the States who had Dying with Dignity had a big party, and everybody knew, and they came and they sang a song and they talked about her and these beautiful things that they said to her and how she also impacted their life. And it was beautiful, and it was heavy, right? There was a moment in the documentary where the next step was for her and she was taking her own medication, and there was this reality point, right? So this was after the party. But again, right, it could be a wonderful thing, but it can also be very emotionally draining as well, right? It can be very vulnerable for people too, right? Where they don't know how to navigate. Maybe sometimes it might be helpful to have sort of a guide on how to do a living funeral or a living wake, right? How do you conduct yourself in that party, or maybe have some games or some way to not reduce, but to kind of frame the big emotion and the big feel, right? I think I don't know if you saw Gracie and Frankie on Netflix. One of the characters, they had a big party and it was quite lovely, right? I'd like to have one of those too, right? But again, I don't have the awareness of my imminent death, so the birthday party is going to have to be it.
That's right. Thank you for that. I think one last question before we wrap up is about end of life doulas, death doulas. Some folks are wondering what types of services death doulas offer, and I think it will be another depends answer, because there's such a wide range of services that different doulas will provide. But could you share with us some of the different things that doulas can help people with?
So I think fundamentally, and I can only speak from, how I disseminate information for the doulas that I train and mentor, is we talk a lot about the container for which they will do their work. So we talk a lot about their particular scope and practice, and their ethical responsibilities. So doulas, end-of-life doulas, are self-regulated. So they're not regulated by a governing body. And so it's an entrepreneurship kind of a process. And so they can serve in planning and preparing, right? So identifying with client families sort of what's important to them. I oftentimes do this kind of an interesting game called the Go Wish game, where it identifies the things that are most important to you or not important to you. And I give it to the client, the person who's dying, and I also give it to the family, the people who are supporting them. And then each person does it, and we have this conversation about some of those differences. So I think, again, fundamentally, end-of-life doulas serve in the facilitating these conversations, helping people to access information that may not have known, because it can be very intense. And I think even in the training of end-of-life doulas in Canada, unlike I think the States and the UK and Australia, where most of the doulas are really focusing their time and energy on supporting people through the active dying process, right? Which sometimes can be very unpredictable, because it's really difficult to be able to say, well, when does the active dying phase start? Right? The laboring of things, again, depending on the type of death experience that people may have. And so their sort of scope and practice in Canada has shifted a little bit, or maybe expanded, to include some education, right? How do we educate? How do we, not only you educate yourself as a doula, because you need to know this, but related to, the rights of people. What can families actually do, right? How people can take part, how people can empower themselves, how they can advocate for their particular needs, how they can help translate some information, right? So it's really, and every doula will have their own unique way, because so much of it is around who they are as people, right? And so I oftentimes talk about, who is your community? Because those are the people that you will serve, right? So it's not about sort of plopping in and bringing in your doula bag with all of your different things. It's really talking to the client families to figure out how you can be most helpful, because hopefully there's a team that is supporting that family in navigating end-of-life care, right? And grief support. And so a doula is not a replacement, they're an enhancement. And oftentimes they can serve as the bridgers between the healthcare, right? Because, healthcare may be there until the person dies, and then they're not. And then what, right? Then it's usually somebody else, like a funeral home, will come in. And so sometimes it can be very helpful if somebody is through the whole process, helping to navigate those transitions, right? When these new folks come on, or even encourage client families to say, hey, you know, I want you to live as long as possible. Absolutely. And I worry about the fact that maybe if we don't put some of these things in place, this is what may happen as a result. And so many of the folks who come in to train to want to support are also coming in from their own personal experience of what didn't go well, what did went well, what didn't they know that they now know, and they want to share that information with others. Here's what you need to know, because when the time comes, it may be a little bit too late. And then you're going to be in that, you know, I don't want to talk about it right now because I need other things to talk about. So it's never too early to start talking about end of life, because death and dying is not about an old person. It can happen to, it does happen to all of us any point in time.
Thank you, Olga. And I
What
think
a positive note to leave on, right?
I was going to say.
Terrible.
But I think this has been just a wonderful discussion, and I'm getting lots of comments coming through. People have learned so much today, and I want to thank you for joining us and sharing everything with us. It's been wonderful. As mentioned at the beginning, we'll be meeting again at the end of April to continue our Focused Forum series. So check your email. We'll be sending something out soon, and we hope that you can join us then. And in the meantime, everyone take care, and thanks again, Olga, for everything today. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Kelsey.